Not many people make the journey to this remote village in Kazungula, a district in southern Zambia. The family who live here, though, are happy to see any visitor. They want outsiders to know what's happening. In the south of the country, millions are suffering after their primary source of food, their maize harvest, was destroyed by a drought back in March. Since then, they've been living on wild fruit and nuts and very occasional handouts of food. This storage area for grain should be full.
What can I do? Nothing, completely. Zero. Nothing. One bucket when you got to pound last week. Pona come Yakamana Takuchque. Mans was it a que or a cagujo, my own Pemazi Caninua. Ah, quite in Jesanum. I'm going to go to Famba and a priest, a conbearer.
If it wasn't for wild fruit and nuts, thousands would almost certainly be dead. While many of these foods are rich in vitamins, they are scarce and not nearly an adequate diet. This boy is not at school today. He's waiting around for his first meal in days, a porridge made out of ground nuts.
We need maize even now, even today.
Chief Sikatana is the traditional leader in this area. He says that of the 38,000 people he looks after, not one produced a maize harvest this season.
The situation is quite serious. We have lost humans through starvation, because of communication between the remote area and the town. That's why the situation is not so dramatized. But definitely we have lost human beings because of starvation.
So people have died in your village?
It's true.
International aid agencies say that so far there's not enough evidence that attributes death directly to hunger. However, illness and severe malnutrition are increasing. An estimated 2.5 million Zambians are teetering on the brink of a massive humanitarian disaster. The only thing that can prevent this is international food aid.
If CARE and others like us need to wait until we get pictures, the pictures we've seen from Sudan and Ethiopia, other countries of starving children, if we have to wait that long to get the food in, CARE will not be able to save those children, and neither will anybody else. We need a confirmed and an adequate supply of food which is acceptable to the Zambian government and the Zambian people every month.
In this warehouse in the south of the country, maize donated by the United Kingdom is being unloaded and prepared for distribution. The bulk of the space in this warehouse, though, is being taken up by maize that won't be distributed. In an unprecedented move, it's been rejected by the Zambian government because it's genetically modified.
This is the GMO. How it is.
There's a lot of it.
Oh, this is GMO. This is GMO.
This is just a portion of the 14,000 tonnes of maize donated by the United States, which is currently sitting in warehouses around Zambia. It's up to Mahiri Takawira, the local district administrator, to explain to the hungry people in his area why they can't have this grain.
It is very difficult, quite difficult. It's a task. It's a challenging task, and it's not easy because you are talking to people who are hungry. You know, it's not easy. It's quite tough. But we are managing, and you just have to explain to them properly, and maybe make them understand why government is saying this.
Stand and sing of Zambia, proud and free, land of work and joy in unity.
Zambia has a proud history. In 1964, it was one of the first countries in southern Africa to gain independence from its colonial ruler, in this case Britain. After independence, Zambia went on to support the liberation movements of its neighbours. President Levi Mwanawasa was elected last year. His so-called New Deal government is focusing on stamping out the corruption of the previous regime. Recently, though, his attention's been diverted.
The offer of genetically modified foods has created a difficult situation for the government.
President Mwanawasa is spending his time trying to justify Zambia's position to the world.
It is not my government's intention to sacrifice lives of the Zambian people by taking this position. However, given the lack of and then conflicting international information on the possible consequences of genetically modified products on humans, I therefore wish to request for your understanding of Zambia's position on a GMO.
There's been little understanding of Zambia's position. It's been condemned and ridiculed in the international media. "Food Luddites let Africa starve," screamed one headline. It's also come under extraordinary pressure from a stream of overseas visitors.
People that have lost their lives.
The World Food Programme, the UN agency charged with distributing donated food, has just arrived in Johannesburg after assessing the food crisis in southern Africa.
Immediately in front of us,
The GMO controversy was high on its agenda.
planting PLA in
American GM maize makes up approximately half of all donations they received.
The issues in Angola are
When they began their tour, 3 of the 6 countries requiring aid were threatening to reject it.
my sense is that the issue has been resolved in a way that is workable in 5 of the 6 countries. Zambia is still sorting through it.
The World Food Programme was unable to change Zambia's mind.
107 of the 611.
The World Food Programme has been distributing GMO food now for between 7 and 8 years. We've never had anyone turn it down, and we've never had any problems. And not being able to use a large percentage of what is available to us, which we consider to be perfectly safe, would put a major roadblock in our ability to do our job.
Can the job be done without GMO food?
It'd be very difficult.
I am saying do not force GMO on us just because for the time being we've been hit by drought.
Mundia Sikatana is Zambia's Minister for Agriculture.
Look at our varieties, typical African. It's so nice, all colors. All this will be wiped out through the GMO. This is GMO.
The Minister for Agriculture has a passion for indigenous African plants. He's been leading the campaign against accepting the GM food aid and for finding alternatives.
My answer to you, the crisis is critical. We must face it. We must appeal to those that have non-GMO. We must go to our other varieties, millet, sorghum, cassava, to feed these people on.
There's no doubt the government is facing a huge challenge.
But for America to force GMO on underdeveloped countries, we say no. We know how powerful they are, but they cannot be as powerful as to force us to swallow, not our pride, but food that we are suspecting will be dangerous to our bodies.
The Zambian government says the World Food Programme, which brought the maize into the country, didn't tell it the maize was genetically modified. The government only found out after the maize had arrived.
Ladies and gentlemen,
in August, it called a public meeting to work out what to do.
We, as a government, are sensitive to the plight of our own people because we belong to those people and can never, ever risk, deliberately or otherwise, risk the lives of our own people.
There was immense pressure to make a decision quickly. Ships with more GM maize were already on their way from America. Zambians were warned that if they didn't take it, someone else would.
I would urge that a decision on this issue be made expeditiously, or some 42,000 tons of U.S. supplied maize, which is currently en route to Zambia, will have to be diverted to other countries.
Already angry that GM maize had been brought in without their knowledge, the next revelation only heightened tensions. In an apparent attempt to placate the government, the World Food Programme publicly stated that there was no need for concern because it had in fact been delivering GM food aid to Zambia for the last 7 years. Again, this was news to the government.
And I didn't hear it officially from anybody. I just heard one official of the World Food Programme bragging around saying, after all these people, we've been feeding these people on GMO for the last 7 years. I was very angry about that. I told them they were not fair and we would never accept such conduct because in America, in Europe, they know they are obliged to notify the consumer, to give him a choice, you know.
The head of WFP in Zambia refused to speak to Dateline. A PR person said the situation was too sensitive. We were told to speak to the South African office instead.
No, we don't have an obligation to directly inform a government of the GM. As I said, we certify food under the Codex Alimentarius, which certifies that food is safe for human consumption and that donor countries eat the products that they are providing to recipient governments.
Judith Lewis acknowledges that GM maize has been coming into Zambia for the last 7 years, but says it was up to Zambia to find out for itself.
The GM issue became public and became a part of the U.S. food chain in 1992. Since then, we have been providing this food in the region. Governments are tasked with the responsibility of finding out what commodities they want to bring into the countries. They accept these commodities.
Do you think, though, they would have known that food aid in particular had GMO in it?
Well, here again, I think the onus is on the recipient country to ask the questions.
Genetic materials from things...
In deciding to reject the GM maize, the government relied heavily on the advice of this man, Dr. Mwanayanda Mbuksita Luanika. Dr. Luanika is one of Zambia's foremost scientists. He's represented Zambia and Africa during negotiations for international protocols on genetic modification. He, along with 2 major scientific institutions in Zambia, advised the government to reject the food. One of the reasons given was uncertainty about the effects on human health. While millions of people have been eating GM food for years and there is a body of evidence that says it's safe, dissenting views do exist. Dr. Luanika decided to adopt the precautionary principle.
The precautionary principle basically says, in case of uncertainties, and if there's no scientific unanimity in a position and there's doubt, the onus is on the receiving environment to take appropriate action. And in this case was to refuse GMO. And Zambia is not the first country to use the precautionary principle. Even the European Union, their de facto moratorium on GMOs is based on the precautionary principle.
The second argument was that Zambia has no regulatory process in place to monitor GMOs. The final concern was about harm to the environment due to the potential for contamination of non-GM crops.
That if GMO maize was distributed, and this is very close to the planting season, there was a very high likelihood that some of the people will save the seed and plant it.
Dr. Luke Mumba opposes the decision to reject the maize. An advocate of biotechnology, he says the food is safe to eat and that while concerns about contamination of non-GM crops are valid, there is a short-term solution.
My suggestion was that government should put in place measures to ensure that people do not get access to the grain itself. And one alternative was to mill the grain as soon as it comes into the country.
Dr. Mumba is a lone voice of dissent in Zambia. His position has isolated him from former colleagues like Dr. Luwanika.
People really do not understand what genetic modification is. And because of that, it has been very, very easy for the populist voice to take the day. But it makes me feel really lonesome in the sense that my colleagues in the biosafety committee in the country have also more or less deserted me on the subject.
Dr. Mumba says he suspects the decision was in part to do with the way it was handled by the World Food Programme.
There's a lot of nationalism in this country. Historically, people tell you how this country helped to liberate other countries in there. So really they felt that the underhand method, if I may call it that, which was used to bring the undermining our integrity, undermining our systems. In fact, the mistake which World Food Programme mentioned was that, in fact, we've been bringing this GMOs in this country for many years. What are you crying about? And that really produced this counter-reaction that how could they do this?
There's no doubt that this whole debate has become political, with accusations on both sides. Dr. Luwanika says he felt political manoeuvrings were underway at the recent World Summit in Johannesburg.
All these UN agencies came up with a statement saying that Zambia should accept these the GMO maize based on saying that it is being eaten worldwide and that is safe. There I felt there was some pressure because I felt the timing by those UN agencies was wrong and they were trying to influence national policy.
Did you feel that your scientific judgment was being questioned?
No, I felt that actually even the pressure from the UN agencies, even them, somebody else was giving pressure on them.
Who?
My suspicion is the US government.
The Zambian office of USAID, the American government agency that coordinates food aid, declined to give an interview to Dateline. While there is no doubt that America is the most generous of all food donors, some critics say its motives are not altogether pure. America is the biggest global player in biotechnology. It produces around 80% of the world's GM crops. But there are problems with the export market for GM maize.
Because the major trading partners in corn in the developed world, like the European Union, Japan, and South Korea, have strict labeling requirements that are put in place, and which means that much as America would like to bring in genetically modified corn in those parts of the world, they cannot.
Neth Danyo, who works for a Filipino-based NGO, was recently in Zambia for a conference. She's critical of the way biotechnology is being promoted in the developing world.
And I think this effort to twist the arm of Africa to accept genetically modified maize in the form of food aid is America's way to find a market. to find a niche for all this flood of genetically modified maize produced by its farmers. After all, that's what the U.S. government is subsidizing corn farmers for, to produce more and find a market.
Even before the GM maize was sent to Zambia, America was aware that at least one African country was reluctant to import GM products. But the US government's aid agency, USAID, was already taking measures to ensure that these concerns were overridden. In a written statement to a Congress committee back in June, USAID noted that one of its targeted countries for aid, Zimbabwe, had legislation that
restricts the import of U.S. whole kernel yellow corn because it contains corn produced through biotechnology.
According to the US, if Zimbabwe wanted aid, these laws needed to be dropped. It directed its local agencies to look at
actions that can be undertaken to remove import restrictions related to the importation of U.S. whole kernel corn, perhaps via a humanitarian waiver.
The GM food aid arrived in Zambia at a time when many countries in Africa were involved in a debate about whether to adopt biotechnology. Many powerful people and organisations are advocating biotech for the developing world. USAID, for example, funds biotech companies like Monsanto to conduct GM research in Africa. Monsanto, who operate this laboratory near Johannesburg, is well established in South Africa. The company makes no secret it would like to extend its reach.
Yes, it's an important market. By virtue of US dollars, it's not a huge contributor to the company's revenues, but our vision in Monsanto for many years has been to improve food production and environmental sustainability, and I think nowhere in the world needs it as much as Africa.
Even the UN's World Food Programme is spruiking biotechnology for the developing world.
The rationale for biotech food is that the use of these seeds dramatically increases the yield. It becomes much more drought resistant. It requires less use of herbicides and pesticides, and oftentimes it's nutritionally enhanced. Norman Borlaug, the great father of the Green Revolution, the Nobel Prize winner in agriculture, would tell you that the use of biotech GM foods is the way the world is going to discover to feed itself.
While there are clear reasons for the US government to be promoting biotechnology, questions are raised when the World Food Programme does the same, particularly when it's bringing GM food into a country which says it doesn't want it.
It's WFP, and WFP is not America. It is our institution. It belongs to the United Nations. And we say to the United Nations, this is not fair to this poor, to this country.
The commercial farming community in Zambia is divided. There is a lobby for Zambia to remain a completely GMO-free country to preserve export markets. Even proponents of biotech want regulations in place before any GM crops are introduced. There is a concern that food aid is being used to force a decision.
If you analyze it closely, if Zambia, for example, accepts genetically modified maize as food aid, so it has no reasons later to say no to genetically modified maize commercialized by Monsanto, because like all the questions on contamination, health risk, and adverse effects on the environment are defeated because, well, while you've accepted it before as food aid, what's the difference? It's there already in Zambian soil.
It's absolutely ridiculous. The plan is to provide commodities, to provide food, to feed people who are going to starve to death if they don't have it. And the countries that help us in this way are very generous. And there's no trickery, no chicanery, no hidden agenda. The agenda is strictly one of humanitarian concern.
Monsanto is confident that the recent controversies over GM food aid will die down.
The truth will always out, and science and technology, given time, will prove itself to be useful. And I think we will see that these countries, once they're assured on the safety of this technology and the benefit and the need for it, that acceptance will move ahead.
The American government responded to the rejection of its donation by offering to send a group of Zambian scientists on a fact-finding tour of the United States. The scientists recently returned from this trip. The president left open the possibility of reversing the decision if the scientists recommended it. Dr. Luanika was one of those on the trip.
I learned a whole lot.
Can you tell me more?
No, well, it will be very difficult to tell you more without getting into what we report. But there are a few things that I wasn't aware of, or a few things which we do not look at, which we now see that maybe we should have considered as well.
I'm asking them, what's the purpose of you taking our scientists? They say so that they get to know more about GMO. We'll see.
Earlier today, the Zambian government announced their final decision. The GM food aid has been completely rejected, and the World Food Programme asked to remove it from the country. In this village in Kazangula district, a truckload of non-GM food from Care International has arrived. Every grain is precious. There's simply not enough food coming in. The race is now on to procure enough food for Zambia without the help of the United States. While 70% of maize grown in the US is not GM, GM maize is all that's being offered to Africa. And as long as Zambia rejects it, it must look elsewhere for help.
I have a letter here where the Kenyan High Commissioner says we will give you GMO if you non-GMO if you want. China, only yesterday, they were reminding me that we have not accepted the consignment of non-GMO, and I'm rushing now. South Africa, it has given us non-GMO. Friends are giving us.
There is enough surplus food in the region to feed the hungry, but money is needed to access these supplies.
We are looking for cash to buy as much food here in South Africa as possible. We're asking our donors to give us cash unearmarked so that we can continue to try to get something into the pipeline for Zambia.
They will have to hurry. People on the ground are running out of patience. For 3 months, this warehouse in a small village near the town of Maize stored some of the prohibited GM maize. The temptation eventually became too much for the hungry people who live nearby. Douglas Munga is the village storeman.
Monday, twice depot committee meeting, and then abantu about 30. Vice mascot driver, amama knife, bahusa mabwe. Fona abantu bakate yawinjira mugati muya kukuhama popwe.
In a small house about half a kilometre away, we find out what happened to at least one of the bags of stolen maize. A few precious handfuls are all that are left. With 8 children to feed, Patrick and Mary had no choice but to join in the raid on the storehouse. Their children have been going without proper food for days on end. The one sack of maize this family took will feed them for only a week. While she's happy to see her children eating, Mary's never stolen anything in her life before, and she's worried about what will happen to her. She and her husband also worry about the maize itself. They don't know what GMOs are, but they say they heard on the radio the maize kept in the storehouse couldn't be given out because there was something wrong with it. There's little people like Mary and her husband can do but wait for international food aid to arrive. There's no doubt that the government's decision to reject GM food has made the relief efforts so much harder.
My song is, show me anybody that is about to die, we will feed him.
But this is not the only battle the government of Zambia is facing.
We are concerned because we become vulnerable. The campaign will be used all over. Why is it only you? That is what America doesn't like. To be told a tiny little country can resist.